What happens when a family's biggest secret finally comes to light? For years, the Robertson name was synonymous with faith, family, and good old-fashioned Southern charm. But behind the cameras and catchy catchphrases, tension simmered beneath the surface. Secrets left unspoken and stories left untold. Now, Phil Robertson's son breaks years of silence to tell the truth, and what he reveals is far from the wholesome image fans have come to expect. In this video, we dive deep into the hidden struggles, shocking revelations, and the complicated legacy of the man who built a dynasty, and how those closest to him are still grappling with what's really been left behind. Phil Robertson's name has always stirred up strong reactions. Some know him as the bold, unapologetic patriarch of Duck Dynasty. Others see him as a man wrapped in controversy. But behind the thick beard and Bible verses, something far more complicated was playing out. And until now, nobody in the family had dared to speak openly about it. That changed when Phil's son finally stepped into the spotlight with a message that stunned everyone. For years, the Robertson family had carefully controlled their public image. Faith, family, ducks, that was a brand. But things were not as clean-cut as they seemed. When Phil's health began deteriorating, cracks started to show. At first, it was subtle. Missed appearances, long silences during interviews, and eventually, complete withdrawal from the spotlight. Fans speculated. Whispers of illness, arguments, and even hidden scandals circulated online. But through it all, the family kept quiet. Until now. Jase Robertson, Phil's son and longtime co-star, finally broke his silence. And what he revealed wasn't a heartwarming tale of a beloved father growing old with dignity. It was something darker. According to Jase, the final years of Phil's life were filled with confusion, silence, and emotional distance. He described moments that were hard to talk about, times when his father didn't recognize family members, when he'd stare blankly into space, unable to speak. The man who once dominated every room with his voice had become a shadow. But it wasn't just the illness. Jase's tone carried something deeper. Pain, maybe even resentment. There were hints that not everything had been resolved between father and son, that maybe the image they presented to the world didn't quite match the reality behind closed doors. And that's where things start to shift. Because when someone finally speaks after years of silence, you have to wonder what made them stay quiet for so long. There's an intensity in Jase's words that suggests this wasn't just about health. It felt like a confession, like a pressure valve releasing after years of holding it in. And maybe that's why people can't stop talking about it. Not just because Phil Robertson is gone, but because his son's message left more questions than answers. What was Phil really like in those last days? What secrets were being kept for the sake of the brand? And why now? Why speak out only after he was gone? One thing's for sure, the silence around Phil's legacy has been shattered. And what came out wasn't pretty. But this is only the beginning of the story. Because as Phil's condition worsened, it wasn't just his health that unraveled. The family, too, began to fracture. The empire they built was facing pressures they'd never seen before. And soon, even deeper revelations would begin to surface. It started with something small, a missed hunting trip. For anyone else, it might not have mattered. But for Phil Robertson, it was like skipping church on Sunday. Duck hunting wasn't just a hobby. It was his identity, his escape, his routine. So when he didn't show up one morning without explanation, people close to him took notice. They just didn't know it was the beginning of a spiral that would quietly consume him. Phil had always been a tough, no-nonsense guy. The kind of man who seemed invincible. He worked through pain, brushed off discomfort, and rarely let on if something was wrong. So when symptoms began creeping in, confusion, trouble remembering names, stiffness, fatigue, the family was caught off guard. At first, they chalked it up to age. He was in his late 70s, after all. But it didn't take long before those signs became impossible to ignore. His speech slowed. His eyes didn't have the same fire. At times, he would simply stare, lost in thought or unable to process what was being said around him. The man who once delivered long, impassioned monologues about faith and freedom could barely string together a few clear sentences. He wasn't just getting older, he was slipping away. Behind the scenes, the diagnosis came in waves, each one worse than the last. First, signs of early-stage Alzheimer's. Then, The shocking news of a blood disease. And as if that wasn't enough, a series of mini strokes left him weak and disoriented. The family was devastated, but publicly they kept things vague. No one wanted to admit just how bad it had become. At home, things were even harder. Phil would get frustrated when he couldn't remember things. He lashed out. He withdrew. There were days he didn't recognize parts of his own house or the people sitting right in front of him. According to Jase, those moments were the hardest. Not because of what Phil said, but because of what he didn't. The silence, the blank looks, the sudden, terrifying loss of man they all thought they knew so well. And the worst part, Phil knew it was happening. That was the cruelest detail of all. For a time, he was aware enough to understand what was coming. He tried to fight it. He pretended he was fine, pushed through conversations, even joke about forgetting things. But the truth was written all over his face. This wasn't just aging, it was deterioration, piece by piece. As the illness progressed, Phil stopped showing up altogether. No videos, no podcast cameos, no front porch chats with his sons. His absence was loud. Fans asked questions. Rumors started. But inside the Robertson home, they were just trying to hold things together. And while the family did what they could protect him, not everyone agreed on how that should look. Tensions rose. Old wounds resurfaced. And when Phil's past came knocking in the form of a secret that no one expected, everything changed. If Phil Robertson's health issues shook the family, what came next nearly broke them. Just as they were trying to come to terms with the man he was becoming, the past decided to show up, and it brought baggage no one saw coming. It began with a phone call. A woman claiming to be Phil's daughter reached out, saying she had reason to believe he was her biological father. At first, the Robertsons were skeptical. After all, countless fans had tried to get close to the family over the years. But this time was different. There were documents, DNA evidence, and a story that lined up far too well to ignore. Her name was Phyllis, and she wasn't just some long-lost cousin or distant relative. She was Phil's daughter from an affair that took place decades ago, back when Phil was still struggling with alcohol, before he found religion, before Duck Dynasty, and long before the world came to know him as a born-again Christian family man. The revelation hit the family like a sledgehammer. Everything they thought they knew about their father, his past, his principles, even his faith, suddenly had a massive crack in it. Phil had always been open about his troubled past, but he'd never mentioned this. Not once. Not to his wife, Kay. Not to his children. Not even in his books, where he often detailed his transformation from sinner to saved. This wasn't just a secret. It was a hidden chapter of his life that no one was prepared to read. Jase admitted he was angry at first. Angry that his father had kept this from them. Angry that it was all coming out now, at a time when Phil could barely speak for himself. But what made it worse was how it forced them to rethink everything. Not just about Phil, but about themselves. How many other secrets were still buried? How well did they really know the man they had spent their whole lives idolizing? To their credit, the Robertsons eventually opened their arms to Phyllis. She was kind, respectful, and, in a twist of fate, deeply rooted in the same Christian faith that Phil had preached for years. She wasn't angry or bitter. She simply wanted to know her father and meet her siblings. But even with her grace, the tension in the air was undeniable. Behind the smiles and public statements, there was hurt, confusion, embarrassment. Phil, for his part, acknowledged it when he still had the clarity to do so. He admitted his past mistakes and seemed genuinely remorseful. But by then, the damage had already been done. The illusion had shattered. The timing couldn't have been worse. Phil's health was rapidly declining. He didn't have the strength to rebuild the broken trust. And the family had no choice but to process it all while simultaneously watching their patriarch fade away. But the revelations didn't stop there. Because while the world debated Phil's moral legacy, another part of his past, the most controversial of all, was about to be dragged back into the spotlight. By the time the news of Phil's secret daughter made headlines, the public had already started revisiting some of the more uncomfortable parts of his past. But one controversy stood out above the rest, one that nearly ended the entire Duck Dynasty empire in a single interview. It was a moment that defined Phil Robertson in the eyes of millions, and not in a good way. Back in the show's peak, with millions tuning in every week, Phil sat down for a magazine interview that quickly spiraled out of control. What was supposed to be a conversation about faith and family turned into a firestorm. Phil made comments about homosexuality and sin that instantly sparked outrage. The language was blunt, old school, unfiltered, and for many, completely unacceptable. Within days, the network behind Duck Dynasty responded. Phil was suspended. The headlines exploded. Supporters praised his so-called boldness and commitment to Scripture. Critics called for the show to be canceled. The Robertsons were suddenly at the center of a national debate, one that had nothing to do with duck calls or backwoods charm. Behind the scenes, things were worse than anyone imagined. The family was blindsided. Some of them were furious, not just at the backlash, but at Phil himself. His refusal to walk back his comments, even slightly, put their entire livelihood in jeopardy. Millions of dollars, years of work, and their brand, all hanging by a thread because of one interview. For weeks, the family scrambled. Public statements were released. Damage control meetings were held. And all the while, Phil refused to apologize. He doubled down. He saw the controversy as a test of faith. To him, standing firm on his beliefs was more important than staying on television. Eventually, the network caved. Fan outrage over his suspension was too loud to ignore, and Phil returned to the show. But the damage was already done. The wholesome, feel-good image of the Robertson family had taken a major hit. Quiet whispers about hypocrisy, judgment, and hidden dysfunction followed them everywhere. And within a few short seasons, Duck Dynasty came to an end. Even years later, that moment still haunts their legacy. For some, it proved that Phil was a man of conviction, unwilling to bend. For others, it revealed something uglier, a stubborn refusal to recognize the impact of his words. And while the rest of the family tried to move forward, they could never fully separate themselves from that moment. It became part of their story, whether they wanted it or not. Now, with Phil gone, the controversy is being revisited all over again, not just in articles or old video clips, but in conversations within the family. As Jase and the others reflect on Phil's life, they're forced to wrestle with the fallout. Not just what happened to the show, but what it revealed about the man behind the persona. And just when the dust began to settle, Phil's final days brought even more heartbreak. Despite the controversies, the scandals, and the secrets, Phil Robertson remained the core of the family. Love him or hate him, agree or disagree, he was the reason it all began. But in his final months, that larger-than-life figure was almost unrecognizable. He wasn't the booming voice on the front porch anymore. He wasn't hunting, preaching, or making jokes about beaver stew. He was quiet, distant, and eventually barely there at all. According to Jase, it was like watching a man disappear in slow motion. At first, Phil would have good days, brief flashes of clarity, moments of humor, even a rare story or two. But those moments became fewer and farther between. He began sleeping most of the day. He couldn't keep food down. His weight dropped. His body, once tough as nails, looked frail and sunken. It was clear to the family that the end was close, even if they didn't want to say it out loud. The most heartbreaking part? He barely spoke toward the end. The man who once couldn't go 5 minutes without a sermon or a story had gone nearly silent. There are no long goodbyes, no final speeches, no grand declarations. Just small moments, a squeeze of the hand, a glance that held 1,000 unspoken words. Jase said there was one moment he'll never forget. He was sitting by his father's bed, just the two of them. Phil hadn't spoken in days. But suddenly he opened his eyes, looked directly at Jase, and said, "Stay ready." That was it. 2 words. No explanation. No context. But for Jase, it said everything. Phil passed shortly after that, surrounded by family. The world didn't know, not right away. The Robertsons kept it quiet at first, choosing to grieve privately before sharing the news. And when they did, it wasn't with a press release or a public statement. It was in a short, somber podcast episode where Jay spoke for the first time about what had happened. There was no music, no intro, Just a quiet voice trying to make sense of losing a father he both admired and struggled to understand. Fans were stunned, not just by the news itself, but by how raw and personal the message was. There were no camera crews, no hunting gear, no sound bites, just the reality of a family dealing with the loss of a complicated man. And that's when the floodgates opened. Tributes, backlash, old clips, new rumors. The internet couldn't stop talking. People weren't just mourning Phil. They were dissecting him, debating his legacy, trying to figure out what kind of man he truly was. But as the noise grew louder, the Robertson family was left with a quieter question, one they hadn't answered even for themselves. Who was Phil Robertson, really? You'd think the story would end there. A famous father passes away. The family grieves. The public moves on. But that's not what happened. Because just when people thought they'd heard everything, Jase Robertson dropped something that no one saw coming. A chilling suggestion that not everything about his father's life or death had been fully told. In an offhand moment during a podcast weeks after Phil's passing, Jase said something that stopped listeners cold. "There's still things I'm not ready to say about my dad." No explanation, no follow-up, just silence. And from a man who had already revealed more than anyone expected, it sent shockwaves through the fan base. What was left unsaid? What secrets were still locked away? The internet lit up with speculation. Some thought it had to do with Phil's final will. Rumors swirled that certain family members were quietly cut out of key decisions. Others suspected that Jase had learned something about Phil's past that he wasn't prepared to bring into the light. A few even suggested that the family had made a pact to protect Phil's image, even after death. Not just for his legacy, but to preserve the Robertson brand. But the most unsettling theory came from Jase's own words, that Phil's faith, while real, had become increasingly private, even conflicted, in his final years. Jase hinted that there were times when Phil questioned things more than anyone realized. That his silence wasn't just from illness, it might have been from guilt or fear. It was a far cry from the man who once preached with fire and certainty. And if true, it painted a very different picture of Phil's final days. Not as a fearless warrior for faith, but as a man wrestling with the weight of his past, his legacy, and everything he hadn't said. And still, Jase wouldn't go further. Every time someone asked him to clarify, he'd change the subject or say, "It's not time yet." The mystery deepened. Was he protecting his father or himself? What's clear is this. Phil Robertson left behind more than duck calls and Bible verses. He left behind a family still processing who he really was, a man who built an empire, burned it down with his own words, and tried to rebuild something honest in ashes. But some truths, it seems, were buried with him. And for Jase, the weight of that truth isn't going away anytime soon. You can hear it in his voice. The hesitation, the grief, the doubt. He may have finally broken the silence, but the full story of Phil Robertson, it's still being written. Phil Robertson's life was never simple. From his early days as a struggling man finding faith, to becoming a reality TV icon, to the controversies and secrets that defined his later years. His story is a tangled web of faith, family, fame, and flaws. What stands out most isn't the beard, the hunting, or even the famous Duck Dynasty catchphrases. It's the raw humanity behind it all. A man who was larger than life, but deeply imperfect. A father whose legacy is complicated by silence, secrets, and struggles that only his family truly understands. When Jase finally broke his silence, it wasn't just about setting the record straight. It was a reminder that no matter how public a person becomes, the full story often stays hidden. Behind the headlines and the cameras, families wrestle with love, disappointment, forgiveness, and pain. Sometimes, the most shocking revelations come not from tabloids, but from the people who lived it. Phil's story also challenges us to think about what we expect from our heroes. We want them to be flawless, to embody the ideals they preach. But the truth is messier. People are complicated. They make mistakes. They carry regrets. And sometimes, the hardest battles are fought in silence. That stay ready moment, spoken quietly in his last days, feels like a cryptic message, a call to those who remain to face whatever comes next with courage and honesty. Because the real legacy isn't about a TV show or a viral controversy. It's about how a family moves forward, carrying both the good and the bad. For viewers, it's a powerful lesson in looking beyond the surface, in understanding that what we see online or on screen is only part of a much bigger story, and in realizing that sometimes the most important conversations happen in the quiet spaces between the headlines. Phil Robertson's son finally breaking his silence has opened a door, but what lies beyond that door? That's a story still unfolding, and it's one that reminds us all, fame doesn't erase pain and legacy is never simple. So before you judge, before you take sides, remember, every story has layers, and sometimes the truth is the most complicated part of all. If you found this eye-opening, please like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.